my opinion, the other half of the revolution, the other half of women's liberation movement is the boys in my country and in yours wearing their hair long, and those boys who are wearing their hair long are saying no to the mask of Mystique. They are saying no to that brutal, sadistic, tight-lipped, crew-cut, Prussian, big muscle, Ernest Hemingway, kill bears when there are no bears to kill, and napalm all the children in Vietnam and Cambodia to prove that I'm a man, and be dominant and superior to everyone concerned, and never show any softness. Well, these boys that are wearing their hair long are saying, no, I don't have to be all that crew-cut and tight-lipped. I don't have to be dominant and superior to anyone. I don't have to have big muscles because there aren't any bears to kill. I don't have to, kill anybody to prove anything. I can be tender, and I can be sensitive, and I can be compassionate, and I can admit sometimes that I'm afraid, and I can even cry. And I am a man, and I am my own man. And that man who is strong enough to be gentle, that is a new man, and he is the other half of this revolution, and he will live longer. I mean, he won't die 10 years younger than women, as American men have been doing lately. And he will also, that man that's strong enough to be gentle, I think, really welcomes his liberation and the end of his loneliness and the end of this sea of hostility that has been, preventing love in this country, and that has been dehumanizing sex and making such loneliness and such alienation, frustration for everyone. And he will welcome a woman who can come out from behind that simpering, mask of ruffles that hides so much rage and impotent rage and unnecessary covert manipulativeness, and welcome the woman that can come out of that mask of ruffles and rage and be a person and be a joyous woman, because she really feels like she's somebody. And then you see we'll both be able to make love, not war. And in the highest sense, I mean, not only between man and woman, I mean, the war between the sexes could become an Armageddon if we don't get on with our revolution. But if we do get on with it and we restructure society to make equality really possible, then I think the war between the sexes will end, and for the first time we will have possible true human sexual liberation, and we will have possible true love, and real love, real friendship, real knowing of man and woman. In the biblical sense, to love is to know. And how can you know when each wears these masks that keep us from being ourselves? And then in the largest sense, in the world sense, we'll be able to make love, not war.
The person you just saw speaking was Betty Friedan, an influential feminist author, activist, and one of the leading voices involved in the women's liberation movement, often referred to in the shorthand or as a subset of second-wave feminism. But what is feminism? Even today, decades after Friedan gave that interview, some Americans still struggle with feminist concepts. Stereotypes and representation, or just direct misinformation, can lead folks to misunderstand feminism and even work against it, even if it's against their own self-interest. During the first half of the semester, we spent some time discussing the different forces that pulled the New Deal coalition apart. The Vietnam War drove a wedge between the peace movement and those who supported America's efforts to defend South Vietnam from communist aggression. The civil rights movement drove segregationists and other states' writers out of a Democratic Party that had formerly tacitly accepted de jure racism and white supremacy. The labor movement, which emerged as a political powerhouse after the Great Depression and World War II, had shrunk to the point that it was too weak to challenge business interests in politics. But what about cultural traditions and seemingly timeless ideas around sex and gender? We've spoken about the counterculture somewhat, albeit not at length, because we can't really cover everything in a course that looks at so much historical material in so little time, like ours does. But cultural divisions are another force that served to divide many Americans during the 1960s, and in many ways have kept Americans apart all the way to the present day. Betty Friedan's articulation of second-wave feminism speaks to another divide that is occurring in American society at this time. A divide between an older system of coverture and domesticity and an emerging system of egalitarianism, where one's sex, gender, or sexuality no longer restricts the opportunities that are afforded to them as people. keep in mind when we discuss the feminist movement that for feminists like Betty Friedan, true liberation, women's liberation, meant equality and liberation for all, right? Not just women. Who else could benefit from liberation? If we rethink how we as a society approach gender roles and sexuality, could men benefit from change just as women aspire to also? Who all benefits from liberation, and what does liberation even mean? But before we get into that topic too much, right, let's spend some time looking at what we're going to cover in class today specifically. Our quote is by poet and civil rights activist Maya Angelou, and she says, "Each time a woman stands up for herself, without knowing it, possibly without claiming it, she stands up for all women." We're going to start by looking at the American family and American family norms that are reasserted at the end of World War II. As we move away from the 1940s and 1950s and into the 1960s, we'll discuss the problem that has no name. What is that problem? Who spoke to it? What books were written about that problem? And what solutions were undertaken to solve it? We'll spend some time discussing reproductive rights, specifically Roe v. Wade, but a host of other Supreme Court decisions that enhanced a woman's ability to choose and control bodily autonomy, as well as the ability of families to plan when they would have children. We'll then address some of the conservative backlash that came in response to these reforms and the ultimate fate of the ERA. We're then, of course, going to shift focus a little bit, and we're going to move away from feminist history, and we're going to focus more on queer history, right? LGBTQ history, the history of gay liberation and the LGBTQIA plus rights movements. We'll talk about the HIV and AIDS pandemics, and we'll close the lecture with some recent historical developments, many of which you may have been alive for and possibly remember. But it's worth recapping on some things that we've already talked about, just to make sure that we're all on the same page, right? During World War II, hundreds of thousands of women entered manufacturing plants to produce airplane bombers, tanks, and munitions to help in the war effort against the Axis powers, right? Nazi Germany, Italy, and Japan. Civil rights activists successfully lobbied the government to pass the Civil Rights Act in 1964, which, in addition to barring racial discrimination in public schools, employment, and accommodations, it also addressed discrimination on the basis of sex, religion, and national origin, right? A lot of times we lump the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as something that only focused on racial equality and racial justice. But the Civil Rights Act also prohibited discrimination on religion, sex, and nationality. In the 1960s, again, we see this substantial counterculture begin to emerge that embraced a more liberal attitudes towards sexuality and relationships. A lot of feminists involved in this movement also put a greater emphasis on gender equality, something that was not necessarily foreign to mainstream America, but also not necessarily seen as the norm. It's also worth remembering that throughout the 1940s and 1950s, gays and lesbians and transgender people were targeted in government purges because they were supposed to be security risks, right? In addition to communists, socialists, and other people who had deficiencies in character. You know, if you had a gambling addiction, if you had an alcohol addiction, if you were a gay or lesbian, you were going to be purged from your government employment. You might be giving secrets to the communists. In the late 1960s, there was a lot of civil unrest and urban rebellion as marginalized communities took to the streets to express frustration with the slow, often glacial pace of change in a period that has come to be known as the long, hot summer. And lastly, as we kind of spoke to at the start of the lecture, in the wake of all the perceived excesses of the left, the massive gains for the civil rights movement, the decline of American power in Vietnam, the New Deal coalition starts to break apart in 1968 with a national turn towards the right and an ascendance in Republican Party leadership. Okay, so let's talk about feminism. Specifically, let's talk about second wave feminism. What is the second wave? Well, a lot of times in feminist history, when people talk about feminist activism, when people talk about women's history in general, but when you specifically talk about women being involved in political activism, the development of women's rights movements, of women's liberation, there's this tendency to divide feminist activism into 3 or 4 distinct periods. The fourth wave, of course, is much more recent, not necessarily historical yet because we haven't had a lot of distance. It's still really ongoing for us now. But in the past, there's this tendency to divide feminism at least into 3 waves. The first wave, of course, was the suffragist movement, the struggle for women, at least white women, to have the ability to vote in national elections. It was a very hard-fought struggle. It wasn't until 1920 that constitutional amendments extended suffrage to women. This, of course, was not the case for many women of color, especially in the American South, but really all over the United States, who often didn't get to enjoy those same rights and privileges until after the 1965 Voting Rights Act was passed. So the first wave, we have suffragism, right? The suffrage movement. The second wave picks up in about the mid-1960s, and this is what we're specifically talking about today, right? 1965 to about 1980, the second wave movement is much more associated with economic welfare, equality, and social participation, right? Whereas the first wave, women were fighting for their right to vote in elections. During the second wave, there was a much wider critique about the inequalities in society that women faced. Not just white women, granted, but all women faced in society. And we'll speak to some of those inequalities too. Third wave feminism, which is perhaps more recent, about 1990 to 2000, you see a lot of advanced theoretical critiques on concepts such as gender. The idea that gender is not necessarily, and this has become widely accepted now, but at the time this was very groundbreaking, but this idea that gender isn't tied to a person's biological or physical characteristics, but is instead something that is not only internal, but can also be performative, right? So this idea that there's nothing inherent in biology or physics or science that says that pink is a woman's color and that blue is a men's color, right? This is something that we create as a society. And what happens when we deconstruct these socially created barriers that keep genders in separate spheres? We see a lot more freedom and a lot more happiness when people can act the way they want to do. That's something that is more endemic of third wave feminism, but is also, you start to see these seeds in the second wave as well. So wave theory is sometimes what this is referred to as. This wave categorization of feminism is helpful for people who want to distinguish between specific periods in feminist activism, but it can also be a little misleading, right? What happens between 1920 and 1965 between this first and second wave of feminism? Does feminism just go away? Do people stop? Is there a women's rights movement from 1920 to 1965? Of course. It just doesn't get a wave, but it is there. How about 1980 to 1990? Same thing. Feminist activism and women's activism, women's political involvement and advocacy for political rights and social participation are things that are constantly ongoing. So it's helpful to divide feminist history into these unique specific periods, but it can also lead people to assume that in between these waves, quote unquote, that there isn't any activism going on. So I would encourage you to, if you're going to talk about waves of feminism, it's helpful periodization, but don't fall into this trap where you assume that before 1965 and after 1920, there wasn't feminist activism, right? Specifically, right, as we've already mentioned, when America entered World War II, hundreds of thousands of women moved out of the home and began work in the defense industry and in other heavy manufacturing jobs to produce materials needed for the war. Rosie the Riveter is an example of an icon of this move. Rosie the Riveter became an icon of the many women who worked in industrial jobs and took considerable pride in that work, which had been previously closed off to them. Right? If you were a woman in 1920, it would be very hard to get a job in a well-paying manufacturing plant, and even if you could land one, your employment is going to be secondary to male employment. And even if you can hold that job, you are not going to be treated seriously, right? People are not going to take you as a serious worker, and you are not going to be given the same due respect as your male coworkers are. With the end of the war in 1945 and with the economic restructuring of the country, however, many women defense workers are laid off from their jobs, and they're never hired back, right? Rehiring preference is instead given to returning male GIs, right? These general infantry who have gone out to fight World War II in Europe, fight World War II in Asia. And this preference is justified with the argument that men need high-paying manufacturing jobs. They need them more than women because men need to support their families. They need to be breadwinners, right? This idea that traditional breadwinners of family are men and that women are expected to stay in the home and care for children, maintain the house. This is a concept known as the cult of domesticity. It's sometimes referred to as the cult of true womanhood. It was articulated during this second wave in the mid-1960s by a feminist historian named Barbara Welter. And Barbara Welter looks at these different social and cultural trends running throughout American history. And she says that the cult of domesticity is this social cultural force that divides society in two along gendered lines, right? There's a public sphere and there is a domestic or a private sphere. And women, it is argued, should remain in the private sphere so they can raise the next generation of children as best they can, while their male husbands remain in the public sphere. They hold on to professional jobs or are employed in lucrative trades, and they provide for the family's economic well-being. There's a clear separation, right? Women belong in the home and men belong outside of it. We see this a little bit when we read books from this time period, right? In Born on the 4th of July, Ron Kovic's autobiography, Ron Kovic's father is the breadwinner. He works at a local grocery store and is able to take care of the family with that income while his mom stays at home and works as a homemaker. This system actually predates the Industrial Revolution, right? It goes all the way back to serving as the backbone of American family dynamics, all the way back in the colonial era. When the 13 original US states were just colonies of the British Empire, this idea that men held employment and worked outside the home and women were responsible for working inside the home was known as coverture, right? The idea that everything a woman owned was covered under the authority of her husband. So the cult of domesticity was used to justify these lucrative breadwinner wages that men enjoyed in the post-war era, right? After World War II, when these GIs come home, they get lucrative pay. And the idea is that because you're supporting families, because wives and children depend on you, we're going to pay you more. It's worth pointing out, though, that these breadwinner wages, right, as nice as they could be, this same argument also undermined women's agency and dehumanized women as lesser to men, right? You don't deserve equal pay for equal work because certainly you can't be the head of a household. You're a woman. This cult of domesticity framework also ignores marginalized communities and the different material conditions experienced by women of color, right? So if you were a working class woman, if you were a woman of color, if you were an immigrant woman or a Native American woman, it's entirely not only likely, but probable that in addition to being expected to maintain the house, to keep up the housework, to raise the children, that in order to make ends meet, you would also have to find employment outside the home. But regardless of that employment, right, women across intersecting identities saw limited opportunity outside of the home. You could get a job as a typist, you could get a job in domestic labor, but you wouldn't be able to own a business, right? This idea that that was too far into the public sphere. In response to pressure from the civil rights movement, President John F. Kennedy signed the Equal Pay Act into law in 1963. The Equal Pay Act attempted to prohibit sex-based wage discrimination between men and women who were performing the same job in the same workplace. When President Johnson passed the Civil Rights Act in 1964 into law, it included a provision known as Title VII. Title VII bans employment discrimination based on race, religion, national origin, or sex. And that last point specifically constituted an outstanding reform for its time. Really, the entire Civil Rights Act did, but Title VII made it so that women who wanted to get a job, women who wanted to develop professional careers, could not be turned away just because they were women. That was discrimination. That being said, these reforms only addressed de jure sexism, right? We come back to this de jure de facto distinction, where laws can specifically outlaw sexist discrimination, but sexist discrimination can still exist as a matter of fact, even if it's not codified by law, right? As the 1960s continued on, there's a lack of physical change in women's experiences in the workplace, in public accommodations, and education. And this leads activists to put greater emphasis on sexism and the informal social system that maintains sex-based disparities. That is patriarchy, right? So if there's a system that elevates one race above other ethnic groups and races in the United States, race is a social construct. We all made it up, but it also has very real implications for everyone functioning in society. If white supremacy maintains the elevation of whiteness above other groups of people, patriarchy maintains an elevation of men over women. This is reinforced by sex-based discriminations. So let's talk about this problem, the problem that has no name. This is the introductory excerpt from Betty Friedan, the feminist activist whose interview we started this lecture with. In 1963, she writes a seminal work known as the Feminine Mystique, wherein she outlines second wave, quote unquote, second wave feminists' problems with the existing social situation. She writes, quote, "The problem lay buried, unspoken, for many years in the minds of American women. It was a strange stirring, a sense of dissatisfaction, a yearning that women suffered in the middle of the 20th century in the United States. Each suburban wife struggled with it alone as she made the beds, shopped for groceries, matched slipcover material, ate peanut butter sandwiches with her children, chauffeured Cub Scouts and brownies, lay beside her husband at night. She was afraid to ask even of herself the silent question, is this all?" So what is the problem that has no name, right? It's this idea that under the system, under this cult of domesticity, under the system of coverture, under the system of patriarchy, women should be entirely happy, right? Once you marry a husband and you settle down into a house and you have a family you're taking care of, you don't have to worry about money because your husband brings in these breadwinner wages. All you really have to do is do the housework and take care of the children. Why would anyone be unhappy with this, right? Well, as it turns out, women are people and they have goals and dreams and desires just like men do. And when someone is shuttled into, this atmosphere of only stay in the home, only do this, it is unladylike to do X, Y, or Z. You can't do this because of reason 1, reason 2, reason 3. There's this dissatisfaction, right? You can't have a professional career. That's not what women do. Second wave feminists start to challenge this. They start to ask this question, maybe I as a person deserve more fulfillment and happiness out of life than serving as a mother or serving as a housewife. Maybe I want my own agency. And if I want that agency, if I want that professional career, if I want to chase my dreams, I need to make sure that there is a society that is receptive to me, that I can be included in. In the wake of texts like The Feminine Mystique, women begin to re-enter the political sphere after initially being pushed out during this post-war reconversion, right? Defense workers who had enjoyed financial independence, sometimes for the first time in their lives as women, are let go from industrial manufacturing employment. McCarthyism and Red Scare purges, also Lavender Scare purges, seriously restrict and suppress feminists in the 1940s and the 1950s. You may remember from our discussion on the Red Scare that there was feminist activism specifically in the labor movement, right? So sometimes when people look at this gap between the first and the second wave, they look at feminist activism happening within the labor movement, and they call that period labor feminism. It's one of the ways you can answer one of the criticisms of this wave theory. But there's this McCarthyist suppression, right? And women who want equality in society, they're viewed as dangerous. You know, you're subverting the American way of life. You're subverting the American family. You need to be stopped. This cult of domesticity in the middle of this post-war period of affluence becomes almost universally domineering, right? If you are not married and having children by the time you are 19, you're going to become a spinster. Secondly, feminists resist this idea that the moment you're out of high school that you need to get married and have children and raise a family. They reject it. Well, laws like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 legally guarantee women equality in the workplace. The section of law that establishes this, right, this Title VII, isn't regularly enforced, and women are still locked out of major institutions like colleges and universities. This isn't all. Problems faced by women include workplace discrimination, unequal pay, men-only help wanted ads, job loss upon marriage, pregnancy, or any change in physical appearance, and systemic sexual harassment that is widely interpreted as just, quote unquote, part of the job. This occurs in both blue-collar and white-collar workplaces. So if you're working, if you find a job, not only are you likely not to be paid the same amount, but you are more than likely going to be accosted by your male coworkers while you're working there. And you don't really have a process to redress your grievances, right? You can't take someone who harasses you or abuses you to human resources and have them do anything because it's part of the job, right? That's just the culture. You might look at things like the Civil Rights Act and say, well, men only help wanted ads aren't legal. True, but again, if these laws aren't enforced, then what good is the law, right? You might say, well, the Equal Pay Act in 1963, that shouldn't make it okay for women to be paid a different wage than men for the same work. And that's true, but if you go back and you look at the written language of the Equal Pay Act, it says the same job in the same location, right? If I own a company and I know that there are women who want a job and I can pay them less because there's this prevailing culture that prioritizes the value of men's work over women's work, I can just create a separate classification in my company and hire women to that position. And of course, they're paid less, right? So then it's not technically the same work because you have these two different job classifications, even if both job classifications essentially do the same work, right? So there might be customer service representative A who takes phone calls for my company, and there might be customer service representative B who also takes phone calls for my company, but I might have their shift end at 8:30 instead of 9, and suddenly that's a different position and I can pay them half as much. And obviously customer service B is going to be staffed largely by women, right? This is just an example of how companies, corporations, or even small family companies can get around regulations intended to ensure equality like this. Women also faced unequal access to education. Astronomically higher rates of sexual assault and battery ran up against legal roadblocks when attempted to prosecute abusers, and could be subjected to forced sterilization when convicted or accused of a felony. Facing these changes is characteristic of what historians call second wave feminism, right? Women's liberation. And again, we come back to this term liberation, right? What is liberation? For second wave feminists and feminists who have come after, dismantling patriarchy, these interlocking systems of oppression and their accompanying socioeconomic disparities, means improving the quality of life for all people. While women grew increasingly frustrated with the culture of domesticity during the 60s and 70s, it's worth mentioning that these same systems also limited the quality of life for men and other non-binary people as well. Not only does the culture of domesticity rigidly assume that women have to remain in the home, but it also assumes that men will primarily work away from the family too. What happens to men who want relationships with their children, but because of economic pressures or social expectation, can't pursue those desires? Recall from Friedan's interview, even, what about men who want to be nurturing, but are forced to register for the draft by the state's legal system? According to feminists like Friedan, these injustices are all tied together. And by having a critical conversation about sex, gender, and sexuality, and taking steps to protect the rights of all people regardless of those identity markers, these injustices can start to be addressed, right? It's just as well that women should have the right to meaningful and equal opportunity in employment, but men should also have the opportunity to fulfill a paternal role, right? To build relationships with their families. And that's not something that you can do as easily when you are the sole expected breadwinner of a family unit. Leading women and men came together and formed numerous organizations to fight systemic sexism and gender inequality, but perhaps the largest and most prominent of these was the National Organization for Women, or NOW. NOW sought to achieve gains through political lobbying and participating in legal cases in the courtroom. NOW also formed different commissions at state levels, which were tasked with enforcing Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, right? So there are already these laws that exist on the book that protect women's rights. We just need to enforce them. And if the government isn't going to enforce them, then we're going to start making state committees to start bringing suits and start bringing redresses to the government so that these laws are obeyed. NOW is regarded as kind of a moderate group because it avoided really radical protest tactics. Now, you wouldn't know this if you were to go back to the 1960s and 1970s, because anyone who said that they were a feminist would be very quickly decried, right? But in contrast to other groups, NOW had this very respectability politics-driven approach to advocacy. Other more radical groups, like the Personalist Political, focused on the difference of women's unique experiences. Personalist Political campaigned for radical change and argued that a complete and total revolution in social norms around sex and gender was needed. They frequently used demonstrations and direct action to raise awareness on women's issues, such as the pay gap and barriers to healthcare. That direct action might technically be legal or not. It really depends on which specific group was organizing it and what the state and local laws in a given place were. But it's worth mentioning that in order to win women's rights, in order to fight for women's liberation, feminists at times did have to break the law. And they did so willingly, knowing that they were creating a better world for the daughters who would come after them, as well as the sons. As a result of second wave feminism, this second wave push in feminist activism, laws designed to protect the rights of women begin to be enforced with more dedication, with courts adopting more binding interpretations of laws like Title VII in the Civil Rights Act and the 1963 Equal Pay Act. In response to pressure by the feminist movement and Black Power activists, the Equal Educational Opportunities Act was passed in 1974. This act barred discrimination in any university that received federal funds. This meant that elite Ivy League schools, which had until then restricted enrollment almost exclusively to white men, were finally required to admit women and African American students and other students of color on an equal basis. This is also when private schools that were created in the American South to kind of sidestep segregation in the educational system were finally kind of brought under control, right? Because even if you were a private school, the fact that you were giving state money to families to use as educational vouchers to get around Brown v. Board, that wouldn't fly anymore either because of the Equal Educational Opportunities Act. But of course, if we're going to talk about second wave feminism, if we're going to talk about women's liberation, we need to talk about reproductive rights. Because reproductive rights were a linchpin for many feminists involved in the second wave. Activists argued that without control over when one had children, women saw little hope in having control over other aspects of their lives. Employment was still, and in a lot of ways today still, is regularly tied to status of pregnancy, right? If someone is pregnant, if they intend to become pregnant in the near future, a company very well might not hire them. And while this is technically illegal, it's again one of these de facto forms of sexist discrimination that's really hard to suppress with laws, because you have ways around it. There are loopholes, right? Back in the 1960s and 1970s, the laws that exist to protect pregnant women and their employment today, if they were around, they were not enforced, but many had not been written yet. And so for women, controlling when they could have children was important for them to pursue their own independent careers, right? As well as just to express their own bodily autonomy. Now, in 1960, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, approved the birth control pill for public use. And this gave many women the right to their own reproductive autonomy for the first time. Now, a lot of states continue to restrict access to the pill, right? Organizations like NOW challenged these laws in several key court cases, but just because the FDA approved the birth control pill in 1960 doesn't mean that women who needed it then had access to it then. So for example, in 1965, in Griswold v. Connecticut, the Supreme Court declared that state laws barring a married couple's access to the pill and other contraceptives was unconstitutional. You might say that's great. And for a lot of people it was, right? If you were living in Mississippi and you wanted to have access to the birth control pill, 5 years after the birth control is made available, the Supreme Court says Mississippi can't say that you can't have access to that pill anymore. But there's a catch, right? You have to be married. Family planning, the right to control your own reproduction, to control your own body, was limited to whether or not you were married or not. If you weren't married, the state could and did restrict the access of the birth control pill to women. It wasn't until 1972, 12 years after the FDA approved the birth control pill, that in Eisenstadt v. Baird, the Supreme Court extended this right, extended access to the birth control pill to unmarried couples. And that meant that marriage was no longer a requirement for women to get access to contraceptives. 5 years after that, right? So 17 years after the birth control pill is made available by the FDA, Carey v. Population Services, the Supreme Court declares that minors also have the right to access contraceptives and that state laws can't restrict minors from using them, right? So it's 17 years after the FDA approves the birth control pill for use, but it is not until someone who was born in that year is about to turn 18 that they will have the right to use contraceptives of their own choice. State and local governments could just simply say, no, you can't do that. In 1973, the Supreme Court also barred states from enacting total bans on abortion in their decision of Roe v. Wade. Now, Roe v. Wade itself is sometimes interpreted as this blanket rubber stamp approval for anyone who wants an abortion to have one. And if you think that's the way things should be, there's definitely room for that argument. I think you have a lot of ground to stand on, but that's not what Roe v. Wade does, right? Specifically, Roe v. Wade, as it was written in 1973, tried to balance the interests of women's bodily autonomy and reproductive rights with the health of potential mothers and this pro-natalist argument by the state that an unborn fetus has specific rights. Among them are a right to life, right? So if a fetus is developed to a certain point, that means that they are now technically alive. They're now technically a person, so they have this right to continue living. Specifically in 1973, when Roe v. Wade was established, the court divided pregnancy into 3 trimesters, right? The first trimester, bodily autonomy is given preference. If a woman wants an abortion, she can have access to one. The state shouldn't be able to restrict that. That is, of course, not the case today. She'll talk about that in a second. In the second trimester, so 3 to 6 months, the health of the mother was given preference, right? We will allow a woman to have an abortion, to have a medical procedure performed on her own body, only if doing so is going to protect her health. Otherwise, it's not allowed. And then in the third trimester, preservation of potential life is given preference, right? So if the mother can survive giving birth, then she should. All of these developments, but specifically the legal decision in Roe v. Wade, played an important role in expanding women's reproductive rights and establishing new norms around sex. Specifically, these developments separated sex from procreation, gave women more control over their own bodies, and by extension gave women more economic control of their own lives. Beginning in the 1980s, however, the Supreme Court began to restrict access to abortion through several legal decisions, while leaving Roe v. Wade somewhat intact, right? So Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land, and as far as the Supreme Court goes, women still have a right to access abortion services. But the Supreme Court has looked at that trimester system and they've walked it back a little bit. For example, in Webster v. Reproductive Health Services in 1989, state laws restricting funds for abortion were upheld. So basically, if state law says, okay, well, we won't ban abortion, but none of the state budget is going to go to any sort of medical services that's provided for abortion, the Supreme Court says, yeah, that's okay. You're not restricting abortions when you do that. In Planned Parenthood v. Casey, the previous trimester formula was replaced with the viability of a fetus surviving outside the womb. So essentially, if having an abortion would lead to a child not surviving, whereas waiting for a set amount of period would lead them to survive, then it is immoral to, or again, not immoral, but against the law, right, to have an abortion. So you start to see the court system and the government walk back the legal protections that were established under Roe v. Wade. Recently, in the past couple of years, there have been even more restrictions on state levels where the specific right to an abortion won't be infringed, but it's one of these de facto kinds of discriminatory loopholes will be established, right? So the state of Alabama or the state of Indiana might say, okay, well, you can have a clinic that provides for abortions, and we won't restrict women going to your clinic for abortion services. But all of as part of a building regulation, all of the hallways in your clinic need to be 12 feet wide. Well, no clinic is going to be able to do that, right? A 12-foot wide hallway is not something that is architecturally sound, and it's just also not something that the majority of healthcare clinics can just afford to drop money on at the drop of a hat, right? So the state governments have ways of getting around Roe v. Wade and the protections that it affords to women, affords to access to reproductive health care, just through other ways. Prior to Roe v. Wade, which was passed in 1973, prior to Roe v. Wade, abortions didn't just not exist, right? Abortions have a long history. If You read the Bible, they discuss abortions in the Old and New Testament, for example. It's a procedure with a long history. So Roe v. Wade doesn't suddenly just make it okay for people to have abortions, and so people start having them. People have had abortions before Roe v. Wade. It's just that with the passage of Roe v. Wade, it becomes legal to have an abortion in a medical setting, so that the preventable deaths that come from medical malpractice in clinics that are not legal, that operate outside of public oversight, the process of having an abortion is made safer, and the lives lost because of abortion are actually reduced. These are all ongoing political discussions that have their basis not only in the second wave feminist movement, but in centuries before. So let's talk about the ERA. The ERA specifically stands for Equal Rights Amendment, and it was first introduced into Congress in 1920. It went through a couple of iterations. The way it was introduced in 1920 is not the same amendment that was finally approved by Congress in 1972. But it was intended to be an amendment to the United States Constitution, and what it would have established, what it would have said, you see right here on the screen, quote, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." Supporters of the ERA, when it was approved by Congress and sent to states for ratification in 1972, believed that it would finally put the principles of equality of the sexes into the US Constitution. US Constitution, right, being this seminal document that guides all of American politics, all American political structure. If you can codify the equal rights of men and women in the US Constitution, that goes a very long way to addressing sexist inequality, to addressing systems of discrimination that are maintained and support a system of patriarchy, right? This idea that men are superior to women. If you can pass an ERA, you can chip away at that edifice a lot. Opponents of the ERA, however, argued that the amendment would jeopardize women's privileged status in society. When I say privileged status in society, what do I mean? Well, we have to go back to that culture of domesticity, right? Or that cult of true womanhood. According to the cult of true womanhood, according to this culture of domesticity, women stayed inside the home, and they weren't afforded career opportunities, they weren't afforded professional livelihoods, they weren't afforded political agency until the 1920s. And this was justified by saying, or by making claims that women were weaker than men and they needed to be protected. And because of this disparity, because of this belief that women were just inferior and more weak, you had a number of protective laws that existed largely to the benefit of women, at least men believed, right? So there were laws that said men had to register for the draft, but women didn't have to. There were laws that said that women could only work so many hours, whereas these same laws were not necessarily subjected to men, right? So there were women's working laws, and so if you were a woman, you could only stand on your feet for so long in a day. You could only lift things that were so heavy. It's very paternalistic, very condescending. But women, specifically conservative women like Phyllis Schlafly, who you see at the bottom picture there, argued that this constituted a privileged status, and that if women were gained the rights that were afforded under the ERA, they would also suddenly have to register for the draft. They would also suddenly have to work more hours, as if working class women didn't already work as many or more hours than men. But this concept of this family, this idea that family matters, is pinnacle and central to the American way of life, was used quite effectively by conservatives in fighting passage of the Equal Rights Amendment. Now, despite widespread public support for the ERA, the amendment failed the benchmark to be ratified by 38 states, or 3/4 of all the state governments, by 1982, right? In 1972, there was a 10-year period where 38 states had to ratify the ERA. this doesn't happen. We do not have an equal rights amendment today. Activists responded to the failure of ratification by acknowledging that participation in state politics ended up being vitally important, and that participation in federal politics alone was not enough to win even publicly popular reforms like the ERA, right? NOW, the National Organization for Women, recognized that just because 78%, 82%, 73% of the voting public at different years supported passage of the ERA, if 13 to 15 state governments were held by reliable opponents of the Equal Rights Amendment, it would not become a constitutional amendment. People need to be involved in state politics as well as federal politics. Now, since 1982, 3 states have ratified the ERA. You might be looking at this map. It is out of date because in 2018, Virginia also ratified the Equal Rights Amendment. So since 1983, Nevada, Illinois, and Virginia have ratified the ERA, and this brings the total of states approving the ERA to the necessary 38 to make the ERA a constitutional amendment. However, because those 3 states ratified after that 1982 deadline, it's entirely possible that a move to actually certify the Equal Rights Amendment as the newest constitutional amendment would face considerable political pushback. So we do not have an Equal Rights Amendment. It's entirely possible that we will in the near future, but for now we don't. And we should not take it as a given that we will get an Equal Rights Amendment. A lot of times there is this tendency to look at history as this constant march of progress. But this isn't the case necessarily, right? In the 1940s, labor feminists believed that after World War II ended, they would see widespread social and economic and political equality with men. But instead, there's a Red Scare, there's a Lavender Scare, there is a McCarthyist period, and political activism, civil rights activism, labor activism, but also feminist activism is pushed back underground, right? When we talk about what the Red Scare does, it crushes that domestic political dissent. In the 1960s and 1970s, second wave feminism achieved many great strides. Right? Today, feminist ideas have become far more normative and accepted and widespread than they had been in the 50s and 60s. The idea that a woman could be single in her 30s and find personal happiness and fulfillment, and if she wants, pursue a relationship later on, would never have been seen as a possibility. But today, the idea that women have a choice, they have agency, and can determine the course of their own lives is seen by at least most Americans, thankfully, as a given. The feminist movement also has a lasting impact on institutions, right? There are many independent healthcare clinics, nonprofits, battered women's shelters, all of which trace their origins to the activism of the feminist movement and continue to operate today. And also today, more women earn bachelor's and master's degrees than men. And the pay gap, this idea that men are paid X amount more than women just by virtue of being men, has closed substantially. In the 1960s, women performing like work, when compared to men, were paid 59 cents on every dollar. And today, that number has risen to 82 cents, but there is still a sizable pay gap that corresponds with sex and gender. So you do see, right, in the 1950s, there is this pushback against feminist activism. In the 1980s, there is this pushback against feminist activism, and specifically the Equal Rights Amendment, right? Feminists are viewed as bra burners. They're viewed as subverting the American family. Feminist norms and feminist ideals, the idea of a woman having say over her own life, did not lead to the demise of the American family. There are tons of American families today. But that repression still comes in the 1980s. Despite this, though, The gains of the second wave feminist movement also made it possible for women to participate in the political system in increasing numbers. In 1981, for example, there were just 20 women serving in the House of Representatives as congresswomen, and only 2 women serving in the Senate. In 2021, there were 117 congresswomen serving the House of Representatives and 24 women serving the Senate. Now, that's, if you're looking at proportions and ratios, that's only about 25% of political representation, right? But that number is constantly rising. In 2019, there were just 102 congresswomen. So that gap, not only in wages and compensation and employment, not only is that closing, but as feminist activism continues, as pushes for equal rights regardless of sexuality, gender, or sex continue, so the situation is going to continue to improve. Today, women routinely take advantage of their right to vote, and women vote in higher numbers than men and have done so in every election since 1964. So we've talked a little bit about the second wave, and I really stress a little bit, right? The second wave feminist movement, the women's liberation movement, is one of these topics that you could make an entire class about. You could fill an entire semester with discussions, readings, and education about not only individuals like Betty Friedan and the people who came before her and inspired her, like Elizabeth Hawes, but Gloria Steinem, right? So we've talked about this movement very briefly. But social divisions at the end of the 1960s were not just limited to feminist activism alone. In 1969, for example, riots in New York City's Greenwich Village neighborhood touched off an explosion of activism associated with LGBTQ plus rights. Now, this network of activists, initially referred to as the Gay Liberation Movement, which drew heavily in its inspiration from the Women's Liberation Movement and the Black Liberation Movement, has since grown to encompass a variety of unique and intersectional sexual and gender identities. We would be remiss if we didn't discuss the movement for LGBTQ rights here too as well. But first, we should discuss some key terms, right? So a lot of people, when they hear the phrase LGBTQ, LGBT, LGBTQ, LGBTQIA+, there are longer acronyms as well, they might not necessarily understand what all of those terms mean. Specifically, the acronym you see at the top of your screen here, LGBTQIA, stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and transsexual, queer and questioning, intersex, ace, aro, and others who have like a non-normative sexual orientation, gender identity, or expression. Now that can be a little bit of a mouthful, right? It is difficult to come up with a term that is inclusive of a community that is diverse as the LGBTQIA+ community. A lot of times, people will use the term queer as a catch-all. It's a controversial term, though, and it's important to capitalize because the term queer with a capital Q is actually a reclaimed word. Queer with a lower q, a lowercase q, was for a very long time a very derisive and discriminatory and harassful, hostile way to refer to LGBTQIA+ people. But recently, activists have started to reclaim that word as an umbrella term to refer to the entire community. But because of that past negative association, people tend to have mixed views on it. So LGBTQIA, queer liberation, if you just refer to things like gay liberation or gays and lesbians, you're leaving out a huge chunk of the LGBTQIA+ community, though. All these different identities intersect in different ways with the facets of sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. Sexual orientation basically depends on the sex of a person someone is attracted to, right? Or not necessarily the sex of a person, but the gender of a person someone is attracted to. This includes homosexuals, bisexuals, heterosexuals, and asexuals, among others, right? So if you're a homosexual, you are attracted to someone that is the same sex as yourself, right? Homo meaning same. Bisexuals meaning both, heterosexual, hetero meaning other, asexual meaning none. Gender identity, conversely, is how someone views their own gender, right? And it's important that you remember that gender is not the same as sex. Gender is an identity. A lot of people view gender as performative. It has more to do with attitude and self-perception and self-identity than it does with the body that someone is born into. Gender identity and expression can manifest itself in a number of different ways too. There are transgender individuals who reject the idea of gender entirely. There are also transgendered individuals who not only say that I was born in the body of a man, but am a woman, but I am actively working to correct this issue that I'm struggling with. That's called gender dysphoria. This idea that internally, psychologically, mentally, and spiritually, I am a woman, but but I was born in the body of a man, and I'm seeking to correct that issue. Everyone in the LGBTQIA+ community, everyone in the queer community is different. They have their own unique identity, and they all interact with that identity in different ways. And so there are a lot of different terms that are used to describe those identities. So it's important to keep that in mind when you're discussing these kinds of issues, the complexity of the community, as all communities are indeed complex, right? So we spent a little bit of time talking about the Red Scare, talking about the Lavender Scare. And it's important that if we're going to talk about LGBTQ history in the United States, we spend a brief moment looking at what the LGBTQ situation, right? What the status of LGBTQIA+ rights was in this country at the end of World War II. And so I have a brief public service announcement prepared for you all.
That looks innocent enough, doesn't it? Lots of young people hitchhike. Seems like a good way to get from one place to another. But sometimes there are dangers involved that never meet the eye. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly. One never knows when the homosexual is about. Let's take the case of Jimmy Barnes. Jimmy played baseball all afternoon, and he didn't feel like walking home, so he decided to thumb a ride. He'd done it 100 times before, and he didn't think anything was unusual when the driver struck up a friendly conversation. In fact, he seemed like a real nice guy. What Jimmy didn't know was that Ralph was sick, a sickness that was not visible like smallpox, but no less dangerous and contagious, a sickness of the mind. You see, Ralph was a homosexual, a person who demands an intimate relationship with members of their own sex. So no matter where you meet a stranger, be careful if they are too friendly, if they try to win your confidence too quickly, and if they become overly personal. One never knows when the homosexual is about. He may appear normal.
So as you recall, during the Lavender Scare, President Eisenhower signs Executive Order 10450. This bans gays and lesbians from working for the national government, because this is essentially because they're deemed security risks, right? If we hire someone who's a closeted homosexual, if a red spy finds out this secret of theirs, they can blackmail them to give them secrets on the hydrogen bomb, or whatever super weapon we're building, right? So we need to make sure that anyone who's working for the national government doesn't have any of these compromising character deficiencies. This drives a lot of gays and lesbians to stay in the closet, keeping their identities secret to everyone. This is another one of these instances where we look at history and we always assume that history is this forward march of progress. Prior to McCarthyism and prior to the Red and Lavender Scares, LGBTQIA identities and communities were pretty well known. They were pretty public. There's actually a book called Gay New York written by a historian named George Chauncey that talks about how in the 1890s through to the 1930s, there was a thriving gay community. And it was tacitly accepted by the majority of New Yorkers, even though there were laws on the books that specifically stated that things like sodomy, same-sex relationships were illegal. McCarthyism and the Red Scare and the Lavender Scare and this post-war turn to centering the family as the building block of American life pushes certain groups of people outside of the realm of the American dream, right? Among those are gays and lesbians. This idea of, if you can't have a family, you can't procreate, so you can't have a family. And if you can't have a family, you're not a full citizen. If someone did come out, they could be fired from their job, evicted from their homes, arrested and imprisoned, depending on state and local laws, even attacked and harassed and murdered. Gays and lesbians were not alone in this. It's important to remember that during more historically publicized periods of gay and lesbian activism, there is also transgender or transsexual activism, depending on whichever term appeals to you more. Sometimes trans followed with an asterisk is used instead of switching between the two. But trans people were ostracized as well, and were often looked down upon with even greater ridicule and contempt, and with greater violence directed at them than gays and lesbians, who could at least say, well, I am, the term didn't exist then, but I am cisgendered, right? I am the gender of the sex of the body I was born in, so at least I have that normativity going for me. Christine Jorgensen was perhaps the earliest transgender activist in the United States and was a very public face of the emerging transgender community. She was born in either Brooklyn or she was born in New York City, either the Brooklyn or Bronx. Danish heritage. Fought in Europe during World War II as a general infantryman, and when she returned home to New York after seeing medical advances in Europe that America had not adapted or discovered yet, decided that she would return back to Denmark and have sex reassignment surgery so she could finally live her life as her real self, right, as a woman. When she returned to the United States, she was greeted with considerable fanfare. People were very interested in the idea of a sex change operation. Even if it may have repulsed a lot of conservative Americans, they still wanted to know about it. Christine Jorgensen went on a number of talk shows. She was widely viewed as being witty, having a good character, was not hostile, but was very gracious in interviews, was very open and willing to talk with people about transgender issues, so long as they were respectable. And she was very well liked, right? Despite this popularity, though, she did not enjoy the same rights as the majority of other Americans did. She did try to marry a man, an Italian man, and when it was discovered that they were going to be married, he was in prison because it is illegal to marry a man at the time in the state of New York. And Christine Jorgensen, despite having undergone a sex change operation, was not recognized as a woman. She was still viewed legally as a man. Over time, networks of LGBTQ activist groups started to form. So they had to form in secrecy and with great care and consideration given to the protecting the identity of members of organizations. Again, because if it came out that you were gay, lesbian, transgender, if you were quote unquote queer, you could lose your job. You could be evicted from your home. You could be murdered. In 1953, the first LGBTQ organization to form in United States history is founded in Chicago. It's called the Society for Human Rights. It was very quickly destroyed by the police. There was a crackdown the summer after it was founded, and by the fall in 1923, it was dead. In 1950, the second organization forms, though, and it has a much longer longevity, much greater staying power. It's called the Mattachine Society. It formed in 1950, and the Daughters of Bilitis, formed in 1955, tried to coordinate more with lesbians, while as the Mattachine Society tried to coordinate more with gay men. This network of activism through the Mattachine Society, through the Daughters of Pilatus, is sometimes referred to the homophile rights movement. And that's different from homosexual because the Mattachine Society and the Daughters of Pilatus were incredibly centered around respectability politics. And they viewed a term like homophile, someone who loves the same, essentially homo and phile is someone who loves the same, was more palatable than homosexual, someone who has sex with the same gender. Despite this appeal to respectability, however, change was slow. It was not forthcoming. And it took a very long time for even the most basic of reforms to pass. In 1962, the very first US state to decriminalize sodomy, right, to essentially decriminalize the act of being a gay man. That was Illinois in 1962. In 1969, in the face of slow and glacial change, people started to get upset. They started to get impatient. And then in late June of 1969, there was a riot, and that is the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich Village, right? So a lot of early LGBTQ community, a lot of gay and lesbian community, trans community was focused around the institution of the gay bar, right? If you couldn't meet someone of the same sex, same gender at home, if you didn't have your own place, or maybe you did have your own place, but if you were seen taking romantic partners indoors, you might be evicted, right? So if that wasn't a safe space for you, if you couldn't go into public accommodations without being accosted, if you couldn't meet anyone at work, oftentimes the only place you could be yourself without fear of reprisal was at the gay bar. But the gay bars themselves were often attacked, or they had attacks directed at them by police in a given city, right? Police would raid gay bars, ostensibly looking for any sort of gender-based, identity-based crime, right? If there is a man wearing more than 3 pieces of women's clothing, that falls under an anti-transvestite law. It's a very offensive term now, but that is what those laws were called. Falls under an anti-transvestite law, and so we're going to take them into the station. We're going to press charges on them, and their name will, of course, appear in the paper, and whatever social consequences come of that will come of that. But police would regularly raid gay bars. They would make a handful of arrests, and they would leave after accosting customers. And in June of 1969, the New York Police Department attempts to launch a raid on the Stonewall Inn. This raid backfires, though, much akin to the raid on the Blind Pig in Detroit in 1967. In 1969, bargoers are fed up, and they decide they're not going to put up with it. And conflict eventually sparks and touches off when Marsha P. Johnson, who you see there on the top left of the screen, but was also the main icon at the start of this lecture, that title slide you can refer back to. Marsha P. Johnson throws a brick through the windshield of an NYPD cop car, and a riot lasting the better part of a week kicks off, resulting in millions of dollars in 1960s money in property damage. Now, when the Stonewall Uprising or the Stonewall riots, right, depends on how you want it, how those terms, how you want to use those terms. Riot, of course, centers the criminality of the uprising, whereas the uprising centers the civil disobedience. You know, words, the kinds of words we use are important. Regardless, Stonewall, while not widely covered in the mainstream media, spreads like wildfire through these underground networks of homophile activists and gay liberationists. And pretty soon after the Stonewall Uprising, there is a sudden explosion of gay-focused community and identity that emerges in a lot of American cities. And I say gay because in the 1970s, the term gay was thrown around. And it was in a lot of ways used as an umbrella, the same way that activists and LGBT rights Q politicians today would use the term queer. Gay was used, though it was a little white and male focused. Again, you see a picture of Marsha P. Johnson, one of the founding members of New York's Gay Liberation Front. This visible emergence of LGBTQ people onto the national stage empowered many people who were closeted to come out. And that's where that term comes from. You're coming out of this closet, this place that you've hidden your identity well within the realm of your home, right? It's not enough that you hide your queerness, your gayness, your trans identity within your home. You have to hide it further. You have to keep it a secret even from your family. It's in that closet. Once people realized that there were other people like them, right? There wasn't an internet in the 1970s. The newspaper, there'd be one of 3 TV channels, there'd be one of 4 newspapers in your city, and that's how you got your information. And if you wanted to go to the local library and look up information on homosexuals, it's entirely possible that that literature would have been banned by your library because it was, oh, that's smut, that's pornography. We're not going to stock that here, despite the fact that, probably wasn't pornography. It was probably a sociological study on gay communities in New York. But if you didn't know there were LGBTQ communities elsewhere in the country, you could feel incredibly isolated. And once that realization set in that you weren't alone, more and more people started to come out. Now, LGBTQ people still faced a lot of threats, right? They faced incredible violence, not only from communities around them, but also from the state itself. It wasn't until 1973, for example, that homosexuality was taken off of the DSVM, was removed from the list of psychological diseases, right? Up until 1973, especially if you were a person of color, if the state picked you up on an indecency charge, right? If you were arrested on a public disorderly charge that related to you, if you were wearing women's clothes, if you were openly flirting with a man in a public space, any sort of charge like that, because it was a psychological deficiency in the state's eyes, you might be lobotomized, you might be institutionalized. That's actually something that happened a lot in the late 1960s and the early 1970s, is queer people were picked up by the police, they were sent to psychiatric centers, and they were lobotomized. The idea is, if we can't fix you, we will at least make it so that you can't do this offensive thing that we don't like to think about as a society, right? If you're lobotomized, you can't have same-sex relationships, and that solves the problem enough for us. So LGBTQ people started to come together in very isolated, tight-knit communities, and these were sometimes called as gay ghettos, or gayborhoods, or gay neighborhoods. Some of these still exist in cities around the United States today. They are less relevant now that LGBTQ people have seen greater social acceptance, but they do still exist. For a very long time, the Palmer Park area of Detroit was considered the gay neighborhood. Of course, once the 1980s and 1990s hit and more people start to leave Detroit for the surrounding suburbs, that title now often falls to either Ferndale or Royal Oak. But in the 1970s, Palmer Park was, for all intents and purposes, the gay capital of Michigan. So what does this kind of resurgence of activism look like? Well, in terms of political representation, the LGBTQ community starts to win protections and representation in local city elections. I always like to give this talk and ask students, are they a fan of Michigan State or are they a fan of U of M? Because we're all Wayne State warriors, naturally, but we also tend to side on one of these teams, right? Well, if you're a fan of Michigan State University, you might be pleased to know that the city of East Lansing was a trailblazer. In 1972, the very first ordinance protecting LGBTQ people from discrimination in hiring and employment was passed in East Lansing. City of East Lansing said, if you are going to hire a worker, you cannot fire them or choose not to hire them just because they're a gay person or a lesbian. You might say, well, that's all well and good, but I don't really care about MSU. I love U of M. Well, in 1974, Kathy Kozachenko became the first openly LGBTQ person to be elected to public office in the country. And she was elected to serve as a member of Ann Arbor, Michigan's City Council. She actually came from a third political party that controlled a lot of Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti politics for the better part of the 60s and 70s, called the Socialist Human Rights Party. A lot of times when you talk about political representation for the LGBTQ community, people tend to focus on Harvey Milk. Harvey Milk was elected to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors in the late 1970s, 1977 or 1978. And while his election and the activism and the campaigns that he launched as a supervisor, as one of the supervisors of the city in San Francisco, was incredibly impactful for the LGBTQ community, he was not the first LGBTQ person to be elected. That was Kathy Kozachenko in Michigan about 5 years earlier. 5 years earlier. Harvey Milk, though, was an openly gay political representative in San Francisco. And after some initial success in his tenure as a supervisor, he was assassinated along with San Francisco Mayor George Moscone by Dan White, who you see there at the bottom right. Now, there was a lot of political infighting. There was a lot of disagreement between White and Milk. We don't still today really know what specifically drove Dan White to murder 3 people. Harvey Milk and George Moscone among them, and a third person. But after a political altercation, he had resigned from his post. He left San Francisco's City Hall, and he went home. And the next day he came back with a gun. He didn't go through the metal detectors that were in the entry of the City Hall because there was a basement window propped open at the side of the building. And he crawled through that. He went up to the mayor's office and he shot the 2 of them and a third person. Dan White was very quickly captured by police. There was a lengthy trial where he was, of course, put on trial for murder. In this trial, Dan White relied on an argument that has come to be known as the Twinkie defense. Dan White said that he was so upset with this political disagreement that he had with Harvey Milk and George Moscone that he resigned his post and he went home and he just, for 27 straight hours, just ate nothing but junk food like Twinkies. He ate a lot of Twinkies, and all that sugar running through his system robbed him of his inhibitions. And so when he came back to the San Francisco City Hall, he was not legally of sound mind, right? He was technically insane because he had a lot of sugar. A lot of people thought this was obviously a fool argument. Certainly, this won't fly in court. But Dan White was acquitted of homicide charges. And just 10 years after the Stonewall Uprising established the LGBTQ rights movement, the gay liberation movement, the queer liberation movement, just 10 years after, there was a second riot that swept through the city of San Francisco because the preeminent leader of the LGBTQ rights movement in the country at the time was assassinated, and the killer got away with it.
About the riots, I'd say that Dan White was let free because one of the people he murdered was a homosexual. If Dan White had not killed a homosexual, he would have gone to the gas chamber. But because he killed a homosexual, the jury, I believe, did not find him guilty. They essentially said it's all right to kill a homosexual, and that's why there was a riot.
I think that news broadcast sums up pretty well what a lot of LGBTQ people were feeling in the US when that verdict was announced, right? Dan White got away with what he did because one of the people he killed was gay. Now, the LGBTQ community did not have a long time to grieve over the loss of one of its preeminent political leaders, because less than 2 years after Harvey Milk's assassination, a different crisis hit the LGBTQ community. And it's at this point that I think we should spend some time talking about the HIV/AIDS pandemic. I have a quote here by Vito Russo. He was one of the leading members of ACT UP. That's the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. It was an activist group that was formed in the 1980s because the US government did not do much to address the HIV/AIDS pandemic that kicked off in the 1980s. And he says, living with AIDS is like living through a war, which is happening only for those people who happen to be in the trenches. What does he mean by this? Well, in 1981, the Centers for Disease Control announced that they had discoveed a new form of cancer. And this new form of cancer, they hadn't really come up with a name yet. Some people called it Kaposi sarcoma because of skin lesions that would appear on the person's body as this cancer, this disease, reached terminal stages. Other people referred to it as the 4-H disease because it really only affected 4 groups of people: heroin users, hemophiliacs who required regular blood transfusions, Haitian refugees, and the largest group by far, homosexuals. And because those 4 groups, those 4 H's, were really the biggest group to suffer from HIV or AIDS when the disease first emerged, there wasn't a lot of pressure to research the disease, to find out how it operated, to find out how it worked. This is largely because the people who suffered from HIV/AIDS weren't seen as full citizens, right? It falls under that family dynamic. You aren't raising children, you aren't married, you don't share a house with a partner. Are you really full citizens? Are you really Americans here? In 1981 to about 1985, 86, the federal government never made any announcement, never addressed AIDS as a serious problem. It wouldn't actually be until 1982, almost a year and a half after the disease first arrived in the United States, that major news outlets would even cover the pandemic spread. Since HIV emerged in the United States, it has killed over 700,000 people. The 700,000 people is largely LGBTQ people and people of color, specifically the African American community and the LGBTQ community, and those intersecting communities have suffered disproportionately from HIV/AIDS. And this meant there wasn't the same public outcry to address the pandemic as there has been for, say, the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, you may look at this number, right? You may look at this number and say, this doesn't seem that bad. 700,000 people since 1981, all the way until this graph ends at 2013. Those numbers have, of course, since gone up. But we've lost 500,000 people in the last year from COVID-19, haven't we? Yes, that's very true. But you also have to think about size and scale. At the time of the HIV/AIDS pandemic, a lot of sociologists, demographers looked at the LGBTQ community and said, they really only represent about 1% of the American population, maybe 2%. It's a very small community when compared with the rest of the country. So if you look at a rate of 700,000 people dead in the span of about 30 years, given recent events, you may think that doesn't seem so big, but then you have to take into consideration the fact that the LGBTQ community is only a small portion of the total national population that has been contending with COVID-19, right? What does that look like? As we said, in 1981, hospitals in major cities begin receiving a massive influx of patients with symptoms of a disease then unknown to the medical community. Now, there's not a lot of consensus among the medical community on how to deal with it, and the federal government doesn't really respond with any sort of guidance. It's essentially a death sentence. The disease brings widespread confusion and panic. Nobody knows how it's spread. There's still no cure today, right? But especially in the 1980s, people didn't know if being in the same area, if inhaling the same oxygen around an infected person would lead you to get it. They didn't know how it was transmitted, right? And so there are actually photos of neighborhoods where there are LGBTQ populations centered in San Francisco and Los Angeles at the outbreak of the disease, where paramedics, not even paramedics, but funeral parlors, people who processed the dead, would not take the bodies of LGBTQ people because they didn't want to spread the disease. And so you have piles of bodies in these gay neighborhoods where paramedics won't touch them. This is the San Francisco Gay Men's Chorus. This picture was taken in 1993, 12 years after the HIV/AIDS pandemic kicked off. When we talk about size of scale, and what does 700,000 deaths on a population making up about 1 to 2% of the national population look like? This is that size of scale. Everyone in a white shirt in 1993 are the surviving members of the Gay Men's Chorus. All the others had passed away. I actually have for you a segment of an interview that I actually recorded myself a couple years back with a Detroit area transgender activist. Her stage name, because she does perform, is Lady T. Tempest. And during her experiences with the HIV/AIDS pandemic, despite having a one-bedroom house in Palmer Park, took it on herself to take in oftentimes 13 people at a time, homeless LGBTQ youth who had been kicked out of their homes by their families after they had come out. And she would take in not only, LGBTQ people who had been kicked out of their homes, but LGBTQ people who had been kicked out of their homes and had HIV. And despite not knowing how that disease was spread, she took it upon herself to care for some of these people. And so I'm going to let her testimony here, speak for itself.
Were you ever afraid when you let people into your home like that?
Never.
Never.
Never. Never, ever. I was a pretty tough bird. I didn't take much, if I can use the expression, I don't know what I'm allowed to say on this recording. I didn't take any crap from anybody. If you didn't follow the rules, you were out. I gave you a chance. That's all I could do. No, I was never afraid. Now, sometimes some of the young people were afraid because a friend of ours, his name was Rick, and he was living in a hotel room, and he was afflicted with AIDS, and he had huge sores all over his body and everything. And a friend of mine said, "Ma, he's going to die there by himself." And I drove to the hotel, and I went and got him, and I carried him into the house and took care of him. And they were afraid because we didn't know anything about AIDS. We didn't know, other than being sexually transmitted, how you were going to get it. And they said, "Ma, what are you doing?" And I said, "I'm doing what I have to do. I have to help this young man." And that's what I did. And then when his family found out, his wonderful family, that I was getting about between $300 and $400 a month from the state of Michigan to take care of him, they came and got him. Transferred everything into their name and took him back to that hotel and left him there. And a few weeks later, his social worker came to my home and she said, I just wanted to tell you Ricky died. And his family left him back in that hotel and stuff. Yeah. And so when people ask, are there any regrets or anything? The only regret was that Ricky trusted them. He always wanted to be with his family, and he thought maybe they were going to finally help him and take care of him, and they let him die there like an animal. And the only regret I have is that maybe I didn't try to convince him to stay, but that wasn't my doing. That was his doing, and I understood that he wanted to be with his mother and father, his brothers and sisters. If I would have known that they were going to do that, I would have kept him. But that's the only regret, honey. Yeah.
So let's talk about the epidemic.
Okay.
When did you hear about it?
I heard about it in the 80s, of course. It was spreading like wildfire, and when you saw your friends that you hadn't seen in 6 months coming into a bar, because we got to remember, we didn't have restaurants, we didn't have social media, we didn't have telephones, there were no cell phones or anything, there was no computers, and no Facebook, no anything, and they were thin as a rail. You know, you knew something was wrong, and that's when it first started to hit, and hit hard. I remember a dear friend of mine, Carrie Phillips. I remember she was a former Miss Gigi's. She won before I did. And I remember my friends all going there, and they said, Carrie wants to see you. I said, oh, okay. And I didn't realize she had been that decimated by this horrific disease. And she looked up at me and she said, Ma, make me stuffed peppers. I said, what? She said, make me stuffed peppers. And I said, okay. And I left. I went to the store, got the stuff, went back home, baked them all, brought them back about 3 hours later, and she was able to maybe eat a bite, and she died about a day or two later. But every day we got a phone call that one of our friends was gone, and it just kept going and going and going, and it didn't stop. And it was as horrific as you think it is. It was. Yeah, it's nothing like now. You didn't dare, and you didn't tell anybody. Dear God in heaven, if you told anybody, you got fired from your job. Everybody was petrified, including me. We all started practicing safe sex, and that seemed to slow it down for a while. And that was it, my dear. We lost friends every day of the week, every day. There was no day that was a day without AIDS. There was none. Yeah, there was none at all.
How long was it before you found out that safe sex would help?
Probably about maybe a year, maybe longer. The young man, the young heterosexual little boy that was 10 years old. Ryan White, was that his name?
Yeah.
When we found out you could get it through blood transfusions and stuff. And I have to say, and I'm going to say this, and it's not on anything that Michelle Obama said the other night on our interview, which was absolutely great. And Michelle Obama is one of my idols. When she said she can never forgive Donald Trump for what he has done to the Obama family, I can never forgive Ronald Reagan for what he did to the LGBT community, cutting off all of our aid to AIDS. That was just cruel on his part, absolutely cruel on his part, to take all that away from us. And him and his Republican Party destroyed us by funding the AIDS.
So as you've heard, the HIV/AIDS pandemic was incredibly difficult and hard on the people who lived through it, as well as on the people who did not live through it. And also, as you've heard, there's a lot of resentment in the LGBTQ plus community and in other communities that were disproportionately affected by AIDS because of the perceived lack of response from the federal government. And right, keep in mind, after World War II, there is this idea, this concept pervasive in American society that the family was the quintessential building block of American life, right? The American way was the heterosexual father and mother, the 2.5 kids, the cat, the dog, the white picket fence, and the 2-car garage. Groups that didn't fit into this category very well were often marginalized, relegated to the side. This could be feminists, this could be single mothers, this could be lesbians, this could be gay men, this could be trans individuals as well. During the 1980s, there was a huge, and we'll get into this in our lecture next week as well, but during the 1980s, there was a huge push back against social welfare programs, against programs of social uplift, against programs designed to help and care for and mitigate the suffering of the poor and the sick. And there's just balancing the federal budget, of reinvigorating economic prosperity. A lot of these programs were cut. And when these programs were cut in the midst of the largest pandemic the US had seen up until very recently, that left a lot of people resentful, right? When you think about Stonewall, when you think about the psychiatric community, a lot of historians recognize that the LGBTQ community has a very tenuous relationship, not only with the police, but with the psychiatric medical community. But this is also true of physicians, right? Of the main medical community. Because of the way AIDS was handled, because of the ways it wasn't prioritized, there's a lot of bitter feelings there, even still today. Early organizations like ACT UP did bring attention to the virus. Vito Russo, who you heard his quote just a moment ago, was one of the principal members of ACT UP. And they really took the issue of HIV/AIDS research and awareness, not only to government institutions, but also to the public. They were helped by some key figures, right? It's important to remember that despite the stereotypes that existed in the 1980s and well into the 1990s and even today, the HIV and AIDS is not a gay disease, right? It doesn't, not only does it not only affect gay men, but it can affect everyone. And very gradually over time, the public started to realize this, right? In the 1980s, there was a teenager named Ryan White. He had hemophilia, and during regular blood transfusions that he needed to manage his hemophilia, he contracted HIV/AIDS. He was expelled from school in 1985. The school didn't want to risk having him there. And there wasn't any law that made it illegal for you to kick someone out of school because of a health ailment or a physical disability or a mental disability. Wouldn't be until 1993, with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that made that type of response to HIV positive status illegal. Brian White just wanted to live a normal life. His family sued the school so that he could be allowed re-entry and resume classes, and he was successful. He was able to return to school in 1986. He did graduate from high school before he eventually died of HIV some years later. In 1991, Lansing, Michigan native Magic Johnson also came out publicly as HIV positive, and this helped to dispel the notion, additionally, that someone had to be gay to get HIV, or someone had to just suffer from a very unfortunate circumstance, a very unfortunate roll of the dice, as Ryan White had, right? Anyone could get the disease. Freddie Mercury, toward the end of his life, kind of the leading frontman of the band Queen, eventually passed away from the virus, and his family and his friends did come forward publicly and discuss his struggle with HIV/AIDS, something that he had tried to not draw attention to in the final years of his life, but that did eventually come out. And for the benefit of other people who are suffering with HIV/AIDS, that visibility drew greater public awareness to their struggles. Again, the numbers you're going to see here on the screen are a little outdated. Since 1981, over 700,000 people have died in the US alone due to HIV and other related illnesses. Now, medical breakthroughs and innovations have made the virus manageable, so it is no longer a death sentence like it had been in 1981 or 1986 or 1992. But there is still no cure. And because of this, many HIV positive people, even people who are conventionally undetectable, still face stigmatization and are ostracized from their communities because of their positive status. And that's true in heteronormative or straight communities just as much as it is in LGBTQIA and queer communities. The picture you see here on the right is the AIDS quilt. It was a collaborative, creative project that was put together by ACT UP and other AIDS awareness organizations, where each individual square foot patch represents someone who was lost to HIV/AIDS. For a few years, for a few decades, every single year, or every other couple of years, HIV/AIDS awareness organizations, LGBTQ rights groups, African American rights groups would add to the AIDS quilt. And as it grew in size, as more and more people began to recognize that this disease had cost so many lives, despite the fact that it wasn't covered in the media, that it wasn't really addressed by the government, greater and greater actions began to take place, and greater change was precipitated by that. More sources of funding and medical assistance were provided. Research was poured into new treatment methods and possibly new cures, though those still haven't broken a lot of headway, right? It was a very hard-fought battle, but the kind of effort that you see going into the AIDS quilt here is the kind of effort that was needed to make society respond to this pandemic. In the 1990s, the LGBTQ rights organizations, the queer liberation movement, gays, lesbians, bisexuals, transgender, and other questioning people all start to make a lot of legal gains. In 1993, for example, the Clinton administration was taken over in January of that year, institutes a policy called Don't Ask, Don't Tell. Now, if you recall, during the Lavender Scare, gays and lesbians were rooted out of federal employment. And federal employment also fell into the military, right? You could not serve in the military if you were homosexual, if you were bisexual, if you were trans. They would actively, the military command, the government would actively investigate and root out any kind of gender or sexuality minorities in the Army, in the Navy, in the Air Force. With Don't Ask, Don't Tell, this was supposed to be a liberalizing policy that basically established if you aren't open in military service, we have no reason to investigate you and kick you out, right? But the moment you become open, in the military, but the moment you live in a way that your colleagues, that people in your unit can see that you have romantic feelings for someone of the same sex, once that becomes knowable, then you're telling, and so we have to kick you out. As it turns out, though, Don't Ask, Don't Tell did not change much. There was still a very dedicated state apparatus within the military to find, locate, and kick out LGBTQ military persons. And that includes veterans, right? So it was intended to be this very positive, liberalizing change, but ultimately there was not a lot of change. In 1998, a university student named Matthew Shepard was tortured, beaten, and tied to a fence post in Laramie, Wyoming, and left for dead. He was the victim of a hate crime. I believe he was a community college student in the nearby city of Casper, Wyoming, or it might have been Cheyenne. Matthew Shepard went to a gay bar over the weekend. This is still, at this point in time, gay bars are still one of the only places that you can go to and assume relative safety, to act out your identity, to be who you really are. And he was enticed to go home with a man, and he is then murdered, essentially. He dies from blunt force trauma in the hospital 6 days later after he is discovered in this ranch field. And this event gains a lot of international attention, not just in the national media, but around the world. People learn about Matthew Shepard, what had happened to him, how incidents like these are fairly common in the United States, even though they're not necessarily covered regularly in the news. And eventually, individual states, municipalities, start working to extend protections under hate crimes legislation to cover LGBTQ people. Now, it's still not a nationwide program. That's still not a national law that if you commit a crime against a gay person that you're necessarily going to be held under the same constraints as someone who commits a hate crime against other people. But those kinds of developments have been happening recently because of this liberalizing trend that we start to see in the 1990s. These are all things that if you weren't alive for, if you were maybe too young to remember, are still in very recent living memory for the country. A lot of older people, especially in the LGBTQ community, might very well remember where they were when they heard about Matthew Shepard's killing. In 2003, 14 of the 50 US states still retained same-sex anti-sodomy laws, right? These laws that basically said, if you are a gay man, you are illegal. Right? If it is discovered that you are engaging with relations with people of the same sex, we will put you in prison, we will fine you. In 2003, there was a Supreme Court decision called Lawrence v. Texas. Lawrence v. Texas struck down the ability of states to criminalize homosexual relations through anti-sodomy laws. It was seen as a violation of their privacy, right? Privacy is guaranteed to American citizens. You have a private life. You have a right to privacy. And these kinds of laws that limited specific, non-normative sexual encounters, the Supreme Court says you can't actually do that if you aren't hurting anyone. If two people are consenting adults, there is no reason why this should be illegal. And so in 2003, Lawrence v. Texas struck down these anti-sodomy statutes nationwide. We may be recognizing that every time there is movement in one direction, there tends to be a reaction from the opposite side, right? In 1968, the collapse of the New Deal coalition comes in a lot of ways as a result from the advances of the civil rights movement, the advances of the feminist movement. In 2003, after Lawrence v. Texas, there's an election. It's in 2004, and 13 states end up passing constitutional amendments banning same-sex marriages and civil unions. More states would follow suit in adopting similar measures in 2005 and 2006. During this same period, a single state, Massachusetts, became the first state to legalize and recognize same-sex marriages in 2004. It was not followed by a second state until Connecticut also recognized same-sex marriage in 2008. But during the same period of time, you have a lot of states really kind of becoming afraid that marriage equality might be something that is in the works. And so they start passing state laws, sometimes amendments to the Constitution, that specifically define marriage as a heterosexual institution, right? The idea that after World War II, marriage becomes this very pinnacle and essential focus of American life. And if you want to disrupt that, as a feminist who advocates for gender equality, or as an LGBTQ person who advocates for marriage equality between sexes and genders, that's something that the state should actively resist, right? If you're looking at the map here, the light red at the bottom as well as at the top, I suppose, the light red are constitutional bans on same-sex marriage. Dark red is constitutional bans on same-sex marriage and civil unions. And the black states, Michigan and Virginia, specifically very directly banned in their constitutions same-sex marriage, civil unions, and any other form of domestic partnership equivalent. So it doesn't matter what you call it. If you don't want to call it marriage, if you want to call it a civil union, if you want to call it cohabitation benefits, you can't have it. Complete bans. This doesn't last long, though. During the Obama presidency, the LGBTQ community's push for greater civil rights found increased success, right? In 2011, for example, Obama ends the don't ask, don't tell policy. This policy that had been in place for the better part of 20 years, almost 20 years, about 18. This allows gays and lesbians to serve in the military openly. This right is extended to transgender people and other trans people in 2016. More recently, it has been rolled back. That liberty, that right has been recalled into question. And last, of course, in 2015, as more and more states signed off and began allowing same-sex marriages on a statewide level, the case of marriage equality finally comes before the Supreme Court. And in Obergefell v. Hodges, the US Supreme Court declares that marriage equality, the right of marriage between two consenting adults, regardless of sex or gender, is guaranteed by the 14th Amendment, right? One of these amendments that's established after the Civil War that outlines the rights of citizens, citizenship, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Specifically, those second two really tie in the idea that you have equal access to a social institution as important, as culturally powerful as marriage in the United States. So we've covered a lot of history here, right? This is definitely one of these longer lectures. As I put out there, it would be one of our longer lectures. That leads us back, I guess, in a full circle kind of way. Some of these questions we posed at the start of this lecture, right? 1965 specifically, you have this interview with Betty Friedan, and she talks about liberation. Are we liberated? It depends on who you ask, right? If you are speaking to a member of the LGBTQ community who has always wanted to get married to the person that they love, they might look at our situation today and say, yes, yes, we are liberated. I can do this thing that I could not do 10 years ago, let alone 40 or 50, right? If you ask some of the leading feminists of the 1960s, as well as some of the leading feminists today, are we liberated? They very well might say no. Reproductive rights are consistently being called into question. There's still a considerable pay gap. There's still a gap in political representation and social participation when you look at divisions along lines of gender and sex. People in the trans community are multitudes times more likely to be the direct targets of physical and sexual violence. When we look at what liberation is, what liberation means, this idea that you can pursue your goals uninhibited, that you have the freedom to be the person that you want to be. Liberation is going to look very different to a lot of different people, right? Are we liberated? It's kind of a subjective answer, but it is an answer that is worth giving some thought about. What are your own priorities? How do you view liberation? How do you view your role in wider society? And how does wider society view you? And of course, all these things are worth thinking about, worth keeping in mind as you consider what sorts of prompts you want to respond to for our weekly discussion board, right? As always, there's going to be 4 discussion board prompts for you to respond to. You only have to respond to 2 of them, but also make sure you're replying to your colleagues as well, right? Really have that kind of open-ended exchange of ideas in the discussion to make sure that we're all kind of walking away from this week's unit really like thinking about multiple perspectives and where other people might be coming from when we think about history and our shared collective past. Also make sure that you are staying on top of the readings. This week, our readings are a little shorter. The lecture is, well, there's one lecture that's very much the same amount of length as weeks where we've had 2 lectures. This one was rather long. But the readings are a little bit scaled back, and that's to give everyone, I think, a little bit of breathing space and a little bit of time to decompress after getting those midterm book reviews in, right? So this week is a little less intense. There's just one chapter, chapter 5 of These United States. Which side are you on? And then also the first chapter of Betty Friedan's outstanding historical work, The Feminine Mystique. She starts off with a chapter discussing the problem that has no name, which you might recall from this lecture if you've been paying close attention there. What is the problem that has no name? How do we solve it? And then, of course, in lieu of an assignment, a bigger assignment outside of our regular participation that's due on Friday, you will have that 3rd extra credit documentary film review. This one is on the woman's film. It was one of the earliest kind of forms of feminist activists and thinkers and writers going into filmmaking, cinematography, documentary making. It was released, it was circulated in 1970, so it's actually pretty early. So go ahead and give that a watch, write a short review on it for that extra credit if you'd like. Let me know what your thoughts are, how you think it might have been received in the past, how you received it as a person watching it today, some 51 years now on from the film's original release. Of course, that is optional, so if you don't want to do that, that's perfectly fine. You can just focus on the readings and those discussion board posts, and that's perfectly acceptable too. Regardless of all that, though, I am looking forward to everyone's responses, to hearing their thoughts, their opinions, and how they view this kind of history, right? There's a lot to unpack and discuss, and so I'm looking forward to those discussions with you all.